gathered for today. The first topic that I really want to talk about is this one comment from my first ever YouTube video on this channel. It's from an account called Morality Without Addiction, and if you want to go to his channel, he has made a very good video essay about this topic. Let me just bring this up for y'all so I can kind of play while I'm talking about this. I think I've gathered my thoughts a little bit so I can just like talk while I'm parkouring. I feel like I then I'll get unenergetic again and it's gonna F my whole thing up. But whatever. Let's go to not there. Thank you. Good. We are back to the same point where I left it off. So yeah, let me just bring this out for y'all so I can kind of make my conclusions and then parkour after I've read. So the first proposition is that ultimately, biologically speaking, the justification for procreation is enhancing and or regulating the mental health of the existent. Okay, that's the first conclusion. So the idea is that procreation is in a sense a drug, because there's always like this biological endpoint where our enjoyment is actually the main reason why we actually give birth. So it's basically like a drug, but it's a very serious. It's much like it isn't an unhealthy drug. Like, you know, you can take so many different kinds of drugs, but this one actually it enhances your mental health. But yeah, for the secondary proposition, if making innocent people feel pain and suffer and die via procreation is moral or immoral, because doing so enhances or regulates the mental health of the existent, it seems any act that makes innocent people feel pain and or suffer and or die is moral and immoral as long as it enhances or regulates the mental health of the existent. So as I said about the drug example, it's basically a drug that improves our mental health, and you know, that's a very good thing. I mean, who wouldn't want to have a better mental health? But the only problem is that it causes other people to suffer and die, which is like, are we serious? Like, you know, and the question here is that is this really moral or even amoral? I mean, everything is basically amoral. I mean, morality is a concept that we've come up with. It's only for us to decide if something is actually worth being moral or immoral, right? So very simply put, we make children because our brain in some form benefits from that mental health wise, right? Third conclusion is, I am therefore led to believe that to endorse procreation on the basis that it enhances or regulates the mental health of the existent, aka you could have potential parents and or other people who just overall just kind of, I mean, it's basically overall parents, but it's like, if you were to use another example, like, you know, for example, the drug analogy that I used, that you use a drug that improves your mental health, but you're causing other people to suffer and die. it's basically it's in this example, like or at least as an argument for and pronatalism. uh it's basically about the parents, right? So um I'm therefore led to believe that to endorse procreation on the basis that it enhances or regulates the mental health of the existing, aka potential parents and or other people, is to endorse acts like abuse. And this is where I actually said the that second word, which is like um I'm pretty glad that I didn't like stream that part, but but yeah, violence and stuff. So uh so that the um I am personally also led to believe that to endorse procreation on the basis that it enhances or regulates the mental health of the existent is to endorse acts like violence, for example, as long as they enhance someone's mental health or someone who exists already, like consciously or like existentially. Um, which like he used perpetrator, which is like I guess a good word for this example. For example, good example. For example, just because like it's basically saying that it's very similar. If we look at this logically, it's very similar to acts like violence and how it enhances the perpetrator's mental health. Because like if someone's depressed and they like go do some thing that causes violence against people, of course they get some kind of a high from that to some extent. Because if they wouldn't feel good about it, then why would they do it? Like I personally couldn't see myself at least doing some kind of immoral thing if I wouldn't feel good about it, right? Yeah, but for the conclusion, he has wrote, I think that to deem the perpetrator's acts as morally wrong, uh, based on this justification, is to simultaneously deem procreation to be morally wrong because it uses the same justification. This makes absolute moral logical sense for me, honestly. I'm gonna be real with you, because it is basically the same thing. It's basically the same thing. It's just that we kind of um I feel like a lot of how we cope with this kind of existential question, whether if giving birth is immoral or not, we kind of cope with it by being religious, for example. So a lot of the reason why we actually see life life as better than not existing is because religiously we like a lot of people are consider no have been convinced that life is just better than non-existence, or existence is better than non-existence. The very simple reason why I think that's a very kind of confusing in a sense. Of course, I do understand why someone could actually think that life or existence is better than non-existence. I kind of do understand, as long as you're like you've been convinced in a very religious sense. But like the reason why I am not convinced like that is because I've myself I I I see life as kind of a limitation, right? So it's like we 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 aren't necessarily the thing that we want to be. We always strive to be something else. Therefore, that means we aren't what we want to be, right? I feel like in that sense, non-existence, it gives us the freedom to not feel like we're not complete enough, or like not feel like we aren't the thing that we want to be in existence. Because we always are kind of convinced that we never, or like we aren't what we want to be, therefore we strive to become that. but but realistically you can never really become something, because the choices that you make, they aren't ever gonna end up in a perfect way that that appeals to your expectations. So the point here is that making someone exist, I don't think it's a question of morality. I just think it's a question of compassion. So, for example, the person behind the channel of Morality Without Addiction, who made this comment and who made a very compelling video essay, um, he actually talked about compassion. So, like, for why would we care about the idea that we cause suffering to someone else, just in order to because, like, after all, your own mental health improves, so why would we care about someone else's existence, or someone else's suffering? Why would we care about that? Like, you could say that it's a question of morality, I guess, but it really isn't, because morality isn't a real thing. So why would we have this kind of very why would we have this very intrinsic uh, desire to not cause suffering to someone else? Like, for example, like I was talking in my first video how I don't really like killing animals in games, because it's just not because of some morality thing, like, because obviously there is an inherent morality being broken by killing animals in a game, because they aren't conscious, they don't really feel suffering like uh, existential beings. I call existential beings like beings uh, who feel suffering without being giving consent to life. So it's either that uh, if you don't have either of the other, then it's not really existential being, because if a being doesn't experience suffering, then it really isn't existential, because there isn't any kind of uh thing that makes their life like existentially bad to an extent. Of course, it's still morally questionable whether if a being that exists um, despite not feeling suffering, but they still like feel the experience of life. I'm back here. It could be argued that it's still to some extent suffering, because they're forced to experience life. But I mean, if they don't feel suffering, then what is there really existentially for them? So there's like two things that make someone an existential being, like that kind of existential suffering, and secondarily, a consciousness that can feel that suffering, right? So so being conscious about your suffering when you never gave consent to actually experience it. That's basically what I'm saying. So it's a question of compassion, not necessarily some moral truth, right? So, like, I don't believe that there's any like moral truths. I'm a moral subjectivist, and overall just a skeptic of morality. For example, like I'm not saying that morality doesn't matter. I'm saying basically that, like, morality is a very good tool for uh, not causing unnecessary suffering, for example. But the reality is that morals don't uh, end suffering. The thing that stops suffering is when someone can be compassionate enough to not cause someone suffering. So, for example, I don't think that a psychopath has any kind of sense of compassion. They can understand morality. Everybody can understand morality, realistically speaking. But the 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 difference there is that if is someone compassionate enough to really care about someone else's suffering, I feel like. So yeah, did I say the conclusion fully? I'm not sure. I think I didn't say that last part, which is, in theory, this makes someone who thinks they are a pronatalist or considers procreation to be amoral to actually be an antinatalist, because um, as long as you have, like, I feel like my part comes in here, or like where my view comes here, is that are you compassionate enough to care about someone else's suffering over your own mental well-being? I feel like that's the real question. Not really is it moral or amoral. I feel like this is logically a very compelling argument. I just, like, for example, I can agree with the fact that if something is moral or immoral, because realistically, morality is just a human concept, basically. Um, but there's still a compassion that we can really believe in, like, because, like, there wouldn't be a doubt in my mind to kill animals in a video game if I didn't have that kind of compassion for other beings, in a sense. And for example, the video game animal example, it's pretty bad in its essence, because the thing is, the reason why we would care about someone else's suffering is because they consciously experience it, and therefore, to cause suffering to someone, it's kind of your fault for making someone else suffer. I feel like that's why, for example, the video game example it's pretty bad, because they don't actually feel any existential suffering. And then there's people who actually just don't actually care about if someone has existential suffering, which is kind of crazy, because I'm just a whole different side of the spectrum, I guess. But it's really a question about compassion, I guess. I mean, if you're not compelled enough that you should care about other beings just because they have a similar existence than yours, in the sense that everybody suffers and then everybody dies, so therefore other beings do that as well. Being moral requires that kind of compassion, despite there not really being a personal benefit for it. In fact, it can be a negative. Uh, it can be a negative for you, mental health wise, because it's better for your mental health to actually have children. I think, I'm pretty sure, because in order for you to have that drive to reproduce, there must be some kind of a biological drive for you to get there. And for you to have a biological drive, there must be a positive outcome, even if it's leading to negative outcomes. For example, we wouldn't be using drugs if there wasn't a positive outcome to some extent. Like, of course, there's a lot of negative outcomes, but there's a very immediate positive outcome, which is pleasure. Yeah, I feel like, we could transition into my next topic. I actually have written some things up for this topic. Um, so about compassion, I want to continue with this animal animal suffering part, that veganism is actually very similar to antinatalism, because the I wrote here, using animal products is not immoral, but purposely giving birth to animals for the sole purpose of making them into product is actually neither. Neither is moral or immoral, because, well, as I said before, morality is a concept of the human kind of compassion, I guess, and also something that I feel like it's been made. Um, I feel like morals were made because compassion exists, and in fact, like, even if understanding that morals uh, would cause less suffering, if there wasn't compassion, and even if morals could improve the the extent of how much suffering humans experience, I feel like there still must be a sense of compassion in the creation of morals, because um I feel like like, compassion is a very interesting thing, I guess. I guess it's a logical I think it's a very logical outcome of philosophy, but also it's feelings based to some extent. Because, I mean, obviously, in order to feel compassion, you also need to feel something. I'm not sure um, where compassion kind of exists in the human brain, but it's still kind of, it's very apparent. I'm be real with you. When when we feel compassion, it's very apparent that it exists, because it doesn't exist in the like, constantly. You can't feel compassion really exist in the like 24/7, I guess. But we feel compassion from the choices we make, I guess. Like, when we do an action, is it uh out of self-interest, despite it maybe causing people to suffer more? Like, not suffer necessarily like a lot, but like suffer more. Because what I consider suffering is basically just the experience of the experience of existential suffering, pretty much. So, how do I get out of here? Can I even get out? Like, what? Just gonna rejoin this. Let me go back to what I was saying. Okay, the element of compassion comes not as like a solely logical a conclusion. I feel like it's a very emotional one too. So, like, for example, uh I feel like there's a lot of like kind of deterministic kind of element to compassion as well. Like, I don't think that everybody can feel, or like, nobody feels compassion in the same way. Like, I feel like there's different levels of compassion for everybody. Um, and it may be because someone experienced something in childhood, or just overall their upbringing, that's caused them to uh, end up with the thoughts they have today. But yeah, let me go to the topic that I was talking about. Using animal products is not immoral, but like, giving birth to them solely for the purpose of making product out of them isn't necessarily moral or immoral neither, because everything is amoral. And I feel like to an extent we can't have absolute morals because nothing is really absolute. Like our, I feel like religion has caused this kind of idea that things can actually be absolute. Like for example, I mean, obviously there's like things like science. I guess you could say that if you believe in science, then you're kind of agreeing with the fact that um, that something is kind of absolute to some extent. Like for example, the existence of the universe and the existence of physics and science. I guess you could say that, but um, that's a whole nother topic. Like when we're talking about like absolutes, I'm not really talking about like uh physical stuff. Like for example, like the physical existence. I mean, obviously, it must exist in some logical fashion because I don't think that logic could exist if that wasn't the case. Like we think logically, but the universe is very unlogical to our understanding. It wouldn't make any sense, like honestly. But um, when we talk about ideas, for example, like God um makes something immoral, because like immorality has a big kind of um effects to our brain and our process of logic, like how we process logic. Because when we logically think, like, obviously suffering is bad, so causing suffering to someone is immoral. Like, that's a very logical take, but it's also kind of it's stating that something is absolute while realistically, it's basically a question of how we feel, I guess. And feelings are actually a very absolute thing. I guess our experience of them isn't, because I mean, obviously, there's a lot of mixed emotions when it comes to uh, how we like kind of live and stuff. Like, for example, we may have an addiction, but despite this, we may feel good about doing something uh, in the moment, but we might not feel very good about it. Like for example, after all, or like after um, indulging in it, or we just don't internally feel too good about it. So emotions are a very mixed bag, but emotions are very real. Like emotions are true in the existence of the universe. Because I mean, obviously, if physics are true and science is true, then the body does like things that exists in the physical existence of stuff. So that includes like brain neurology and stuff. So I've been talking about this topic and I feel like I don't really have much else to talk about it. I'm just gonna